Hello again, everybody. We're reading Wuthering Heights. This is chapter 6 that we're on now. Let me just have a little sip of water before we get started. Don't forget you can make any comments you like in the comment box below. And if you tap onto my face down there, you'll subscribe to me, so you can listen to the rest of Wuthering Heights. So, chapter 6. Mr. Hindley came home to the funeral, and, a thing that amazed us, and set his neighbours gossiping right and left, he brought a wife with him. What she was, and where she was born, he never informed us. Probably she had neither money nor name to recommend her, or he would scarcely have kept the union from his father. She was not one that would have disturbed the house much on her own account. Every object she saw, the moment she crossed the threshold, appears to delight her, and every circumstance that took place about her, except the preparing for the burial and the presence of the mourners. I thought she was half silly from her behaviour while that went on. She ran into her chamber and made me come with her, though I should have been dressing the children, and there she sat shivering and clasping her hands and asking repeatedly, "Are they gone yet?" Then she began describing with hysterical emotion the effect it produced on her to see black, and started and trembled, and at last fell weeping, and when I asked what was the matter, answered she didn't know, but she felt so afraid of dying. I imagined her as little likely to die as myself. She was rather thin, but young and fresh-complexioned, and her eyes sparkled as bright as diamonds. I did remark, to be sure, that mounting the stairs made her breathe very quick, and that the least sudden noise set her all in a quiver, and that she coughed troublesomely sometimes. But I knew nothing of what these symptoms portended, and had no impulse to sympathise with her. We don't in general take to foreigners here, Mr. Lockwood, unless they take to us first. Young Earnshaw was altered considerably in the 3 years of his absence. He had grown sparer, and lost his colour, and spoke and dressed quite differently. And on the very day of his return, he told Joseph and me we must henceforth quarter ourselves in the back kitchen, and leave the house for him. Instead, he would have carpeted and papered a small spare room for a parlour, but his wife expressed such pleasure at the white floor and huge glowing fireplace, at the pewter dishes, the delf case and dog kennel, and the wide space there was to move about in, where they usually sat, that he thought it unnecessary to her comfort, and so dropped his intention. She expressed pleasure, too, at finding a sister among her new acquaintance, and she prattled to Catherine and kissed her, and ran about with her, and gave her quantities of presents at the beginning. Her affection tired very soon, however, and when she grew peevish, Hindley became tyrannical. The few words from her, evincing a dislike to Heathcliff, were enough to rouse in him all his old hatred of the boy. He drove him from their company to the servants, deprived him of the instructions of the curate, and insisted that he should labour out of doors instead, compelling him to do so as hard as any other lad on the farm. He bore his degradation pretty well at first, because Cathy taught him what she had learned, and worked or played with him in the fields. They both promised fair to grow up as rude as savages, the young master being entirely negligent how they behaved. And what they did, so they kept clear of him. He would not even have seen after going to church on Sundays. Only Joseph and the curate reprimanded his carelessness when they absented themselves, and that reminded him to order Heathcliff a flogging and Catherine a fast from dinner or supper. But it was one of their chief amusements to run away to the moors in the morning and remain there all day, and the after punishment grew a mere thing to laugh at. The curate might set as many chapters as he pleased for Catherine to get by heart, and Joseph might thrash Heathcliff till his arm ached. They forgot everything the minute they were together again, at least the minute they had contrived some naughty plan of revenge. And many a time I have cried to myself to watch them growing more reckless daily, and I dare not speak a syllable for fear of losing the small power I still retained over the unfriended creatures. One Sunday evening, it chanced that they were banished from the sitting-room for making a noise or a light offence of the kind. And when I went to call them to supper, I could discover them nowhere. We searched the house, above and below, and the yard and stables. They were invisible, and at last Hindley, in a passion, told us to bolt the doors and swore nobody should let them in that night. The household went to bed, and I, too anxious to lie down, opened my lattice and put my head out to hearken, though it rained, determined to admit them in spite of the prohibition, should they return. In a while I distinguished steps coming up the road, and the light of a lantern glimmering through the gate. I threw a shawl over my head and ran to prevent them from waking Mr. Earnshaw by knocking. There was Heathcliff by himself. It gave me a start to see him alone. "Where's Miss Catherine?" I cried hurriedly. "No accident, I hope?" "At Thrushcross Grange," he answered. "And I would have been there too, but they had not the manners to ask me to stay." "Well, you will catch it," I said. "You'll never be content till you're sent about your business. What in the world led you to wandering to Thrushcross Grange?" "Let me get off my wet clothes and I'll tell you about it, Nelly," he replied. I bid him beware of rousing the master, and while he undressed and I was waiting to put out the candle, he continued. "Cathy and I escaped from the wash-house to have a ramble at liberty, and getting a glimpse of the Grange lights, we thought we would just go and see whether the Lintons passed their Sunday evenings standing shivering in corners, while their father and mother sat eating and drinking and singing and laughing and burning their eyes out by the fire. Do you think they do? Or reading sermons and being catechised by the manservant and set to learn a column of scripture names if they don't answer properly? Probably not, I responded. They are good children, no doubt, and don't deserve the treatment you receive for your bad conduct. Don't you cant, Nelly, he said. Nonsense. We ran from the top of the heights to the park without stopping, Catherine completely beaten in the race because she was barefoot. You'll have to seek for our shoes in the bog tomorrow. We crept through a broken hedge, groped our way up the path, and planted ourselves on a flower pot under the drawing-room window. The light came from thence. They had not put up the shutters, and the curtains were only half closed. Both of us were able to look in by standing on the basement and clinging to the ledge, and we saw, it was beautiful, a splendid place carpeted with crimson and crimson-covered chairs and tables and a pure white ceiling bordered by gold, a shower of glass drops hanging in silver chains from the centre and shimmering with little soft tapers. Old Mr. and Mrs. Linton were not there. Edgar and his sister had it entirely to themselves. Shouldn't they have been happy? We should have thought ourselves in heaven. And now, guess what your good children were doing. Isabella, I believe she is 11, a year younger than Cathy, lay screaming at the farther end of the room, shrieking as if witches were running red-hot needles into her. Edgar stood on the hearth, weeping silently. In the middle of the table sat a dog, shaking its paw and yelping, which from their mutual accusations we understood they had nearly pulled in two between them. The idiots! That was their pleasure, to quarrel who should hold a heap of warm hair, and each began to cry because both, after struggling to get it, refused to take it. We laughed outright at the petted thing. We despised them. When would you catch me wishing to have what Catherine wanted, or find us by ourselves seeking entertainment and yelling and sobbing and rolling on the ground, dividing by the whole room? I'd not exchange for 1,000 lives my condition here for Edgar Linton's at Thrushcross Grange, not if I might have the privilege of flinging Joseph off the highest gable and painting the house front with Hindley's blood. Oh, hush, hush, I interrupted. Still, you have not told me, Heathcliff, how Catherine is left behind. I told you we laughed, he answered. The Lintons heard us, and with one accord they shot like arrows to the door. There was silence and a cry, "Oh, Mama, Mama! Oh, Papa! Oh, Mama, come here! Oh, Papa, oh!" They really did howl out something in that way. We made frightful noises to terrify them still more, and then we dropped off the ledge because somebody was drawing the bars, and we felt we had better flee. I had Cathy by the hand, and she was urging her on, when all at once she fell down. "Run, Heathcliff, run!" she whispered. "Run, Heathcliff, run! They have let the bulldog loose, and he holds me." The devil had seized her ankle, Nelly. I heard his abominable snorting. She did not yell out, no. She would have scorned to do it if she had been spitted on the horns of a mad cow. I did, though. I vociferated curses enough to annihilate any fiend in Christendom, and I got a stone and thrust it between his jaws and tried with all my might to cram it down his throat. A beast of a servant came up with a lantern and at last shouting, "Keep fast, Skulker, keep fast!" He changed his note, however, when he saw Skulker's game. The dog was throttled off, his huge purple tongue hanging half a foot out of his mouth and his pendant lips streaming with a bloody slaver. The man took Cathy up. She was sick, not from fear, I'm certain, but from pain. He carried her in. I followed, grumbling execrations and vengeance. "What pray, Robert?" hallooed Linton from the entrance. "Skulker has caught a little girl, sir," he replied, "and there's a lad here," he added, making a clutch at me, "who looks an out-and-outer. Very like the robbers were for putting them through the window to open the doors to the gang after they were asleep, and that they might murder us at their ease. Hold your tongue, you foul-mouthed thief, you. You shall go to the gallows for this, Mr. Linton, sir. Don't lay by your gun." "No, no, Robert," said the old fool. "The rascals knew that yesterday was my rent day. They thought to have me cleverly. Come in, I'll furnish them a reception. There, John, fasten the chain. Give Skulker some water, Jenny. To beard a magistrate in his stronghold, and on the Sabbath too. Where will their insolence stop? Oh, my dear Mary, look here. Don't be afraid, it is but a boy. Yet the villain scowls so plainly in his face. Would it not be a kindness to the country to hang him at once before he shows his true nature and acts as well as features?" He pulled me under the chandelier, and Mrs. Linton placed her spectacles on her nose and raised her hands in horror. The cowardly children crept nearer also, Isabella lisping, "Frightful thing, put him in the cellar, Papa. He's exact like the son of the fortune-teller that stole my tame pheasant, isn't he, Edgar?" While they examined me, Cathy came round and heard the last speech and laughed. Edgar Linton, after an inquisitive stare, collected sufficient wit to recognise her. They see us at church, you know, though we seldom meet elsewhere. "That's Miss Earnshaw," he whispered to his mother. "And look how Skulker has bitten her. How her foot bleeds." "Miss Earnshaw? Nonsense!" cried the dame. "Miss Earnshaw scouring the country with a gipsy? And me, my dear, the child is in mourning, surely it is, and she may be lamed for life." "What culpable carelessness in her brother!" exclaimed Mr. Linton, turning from me to Catherine. "I've understood from Shielders, that was the curate, sir, that he lets her grow up in absolute heathenism. But who is this? Where did she pick up this companion? Oh, I declare that he is that strange acquisition my late neighbour made on his journey to Liverpool, a little Lascar or an American or Spanish castaway." "A wicked boy at all events," remarked the old lady, "and quite unfit for a decent house. Did you notice his language, Linton? I'm shocked that my children should have heard it." I recommenced cursing. "Don't be angry, Nelly." And so Robert was ordered to take me off. I refused to go without Cathy. He dragged me into the garden, pushed the lantern into my hand, assured me that Mr. Earnshaw should be informed of my behaviour, and bidding me march directly, secured the door again. The curtains were still looped at one corner, and I resumed my station as spy, because if Catherine had wished to return, I intended shattering that great glass panes into a million fragments unless they let her out. She sat on the sofa quietly. Mrs. Linton took off the grey cloak of the dairymaid, which she had bothered for our excursions. Shaking her head and expostulating with her, I suppose, she was a young lady, and they made a distinction between her treatment and mine. Then the woman servant brought a basin of warm water and washed her feet. And Mr. Linton mixed a tumbler of negus, and Isabella emptied a plate of cakes into her lap, and Edgar stood gaping at a distance. Afterwards, they dried and combed her beautiful hair, and gave her a pair of enormous slippers, and wheeled her to the fire, and I left her as merry as she could be, dividing her food between the little dog and Skulker, whose nose she pinched as she ate, and kindling a spark of spirit in the vacant blue eyes of the Lintons, a dim reflection from her own enchanting face. I saw they were full of stupid admiration. She is so immeasurably superior to them, to everybody on earth, is she not, Nelly? "There will come more of this business than you reckon on," I answered, covering him up with and extinguishing the light. "You are incurable, Heathcliff, and Mr. Hindley will have to proceed to extremities. See if he won't." My words came truer than I desired. The luckless adventure made Earnshaw furious, and then Mr. Linton, to mend matters, paid us a visit himself on the morrow, and read the young master such a lecture on the road he guided his family that he was stirred to look about him in earnest. Heathcliff received no flogging, but he was told that the first word he spoke to Miss Catherine should ensure a dismissal, and Mrs. Earnshaw undertook to keep her sister-in-law in due restraint when she returned home, employing art, not force. With force she would have found it impossible. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Chapter 7. Cathy stayed at Thrushcross Grange 5 weeks, till Christmas. By that time her ankle was thoroughly cured and her manners much improved. The mistress visited her often, in the interval, and commenced her plan of reform by trying to raise her self-respect with fine clothes and flattery, which she took readily, so that instead of a wild, hatless little savage jumping into the house and rushing to squeeze us all breathless, there lighted from a handsome black pony a very dignified person, with brown ringlets falling from the cover of a feathered beaver, and a long cloth habit which she was obliged to hold up with both hands that she might sail in. Hindley lifted her from her horse, exclaiming delightedly, "Why, Cathy, you are quite a beauty! I should scarcely have known you. You look like a little lady now. Isabella Linton is not to be compared with her, is she, Francis?" "Isabella has not her natural advantages," replied his wife, "but she must mind and not grow wild again. Ellen, help Miss Catherine off with her things. Stay, dear. Will you disarrange your curls? Let me untie your hat." I removed the habit, and there shone forth, beneath a grand plaid silk frock, white trousers and burnished shoes, and while her eyes sparkled joyfully when the dogs came bounding up to welcome her, she dared hardly touch them lest they should fawn upon her splendid garments. She kissed me gently. I was all flour making the Christmas cake, and would not have done to give me a hug, and then she looked round for Heathcliff. Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw watched anxiously their meeting, thinking it would enable them to judge in some measure what grounds they had for hoping to succeed in separating the two friends. Heathcliff was hard to discover at first. If he were careless and uncared for before Catherine's absence, he had been 10 times more so since. Nobody but I did him the kindness to call him a dirty boy and bid him wash himself once a week, and children of his age seldom have a natural pleasure in soap and water. Therefore, not to mention his clothes, which had seen 3 months' service in mire and dust, and his thick uncombed hair, the surface of his face and hands was dismally beclouded. I might well skulk behind the settle on beholding such a bright, gentle damsel enter the house, instead of a rough-headed counterpart to himself as he expected. "Is Heathcliff not here?" she demanded, pulling off her gloves and displaying fingers wonderfully whitened with doing nothing and staying indoors. "Heathcliff, you may come forward," cried Mr. Hindley, enjoying his discomfiture and gratified to see what a forbidding young blackguard he would be compelled to present himself. "You may come and wish Miss Catherine welcome, like the other servants." Cathy, catching a glimpse of her friend in his concealment, flew to embrace him. She bestowed 7 or 8 kisses on his cheek within the second, and then stopped, and drawing back, burst into a laugh, exclaiming, "Why, how very black and cross you look, and how funny and grim! But that's because I'm used to Edgar and Isabella Linton. Well, Heathcliff, have you forgotten me?" She had some reason to put the question, for shame and pride threw double gloom over his countenance and kept him immovable. "Shake hands, Heathcliff," said Mr. Earnshaw condescendingly. "Once in a way, that is permitted." "I shall not," replied the boy, finding his tongue at last. "I shall not stand to be laughed at. I shall not bear it." And he would have broken from the circle, but Miss Cathy seized him again. "I do not mean to laugh at you," she said. "I could not hinder myself. Heathcliff, shake hands at least." What are you sulking for? It was only that you looked odd. If you wash your face and brush your hair, it'll be all right. But you're so dirty. She gazed concernedly at the dusky fingers she held in her own, and also at her dress, which she feared had gained no embellishment from his contact with his. You needn't have touched me, he answered, following her eye and snatching away his hand. I shall be as dirty as I please, and I like to be dirty, and I will be dirty. With that, he dashed head foremost out of the room, amid the merriment of the master and mistress, and to the serious disturbance of Catherine, who could not comprehend how her remarks should have produced such an exhibition of bad temper. It's a wee bit more water. After playing lady's maid to the newcomer, and putting my cakes in the oven, and making the house and kitchen cheerful with great fires befitting Christmas Eve, I prepared to sit down and amuse myself by singing carols all alone, regardless of Joseph's affirmations that he considered the merry tunes that I chose as next door to songs. Shocking, songs. He had retired to private prayer in his chamber, and Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw were engaging Mrs. attention by sundry gay trifles brought for her to present to the little Lintons as an acknowledgment of their kindness. They had invited them to spend the morrow at Wuthering Heights, and the invitation had been accepted on one condition. Mrs. Linton begged that her darlings might be kept carefully apart from that naughty, swearing boy. Under these circumstances, I remained solitary. I smelt the rich scent of the heating spices, and admired the shining kitchen utensils, the polished clock decked in holly, the silver mugs ranged on a tray ready to be filled with mulled ale for supper, and above all, the speckless purity of my particular care, the scoured and well-swept floor. I gave due inward applause to every object, and then I remembered how old Earnshaw used to come in when all was tidied and call me a cant lass, and slip a shilling into my hand as a Christmas box. And from that I went on to think of his fondness for Heathcliff, and his dread lest he should suffer neglect after death had removed him. And that naturally led me to consider the poor lad's situation now. From singing, I changed my mind to crying. It struck me soon, however, there would be more sense in endeavouring to repair some of his wrongs than shedding tears over them. I got up and walked into the court to seek him. He was not far. I found him smoothing the glossy coat of a new pony in the stable, and feeding the other beasts according to custom. "Make haste, Heathcliff," I said. "The kitchen is so comfortable, and Joseph is upstairs. Make haste, and let me dress you smart before Miss Cathy comes out. And then you can sit together, and the whole hearth to yourself, and have a long chatter till bedtime." He proceeded with his task, and never turned his head towards me. "Come, are you coming?" I continued. "There's a little cake for each of you, nearly enough, and you'll need half an hour's donning." I waited 5 minutes, but getting no answer, left him. Catherine supped with her brother and sister-in-law. Joseph and I joined at an unsociable meal, seasoned with reproofs on one side and sauciness on the other. His cake and cheese remained on the table all night for the fairies. He managed to continue work till 9 o'clock, and then marched dumb and dour to his chamber. Cathy sat up late. A world of things to order for the reception of her new friends. She came into the kitchen once to speak to her old one, but he was gone, and she only stayed to ask what was the matter with him, and then went back. In the morning, he rose early. It was a holiday, carried his ill humour onto the moors, not reappearing till the family were departed for church. Fasting and reflection seemed to have brought him to a better spirit. He hung about me for a while, and having screwed up his courage, exclaimed abruptly, "Nelly, make me decent. I'm going to be good." "High time, Heathcliff," I said. "You have grieved Catherine. She's sorry she ever came home, I dare say. It looks as if you have envied her, but she is more thought of than you." Sorry, because she is more thought of than you. The notion of envying Catherine was incomprehensible to him, but the notion of grieving her he understood clearly enough. "Did she say she was grieved?" he inquired, looking very serious. "She cried when I told you we were going off again this morning." "Well, I cried last night," he returned, "and I had more reason to cry than she." "Yes, you had the reason of going to bed with a proud heart and an empty stomach," said I. "Proud people breed sad sorrows for themselves." That's a good phrase, isn't it? proud people breed sad sorrows from themselves. I like that. But if you be ashamed of your touchiness, you must ask pardon. Mind, when she comes in, you must go up and offer to kiss her and say, you know best what to say, only do it heartily, and not as if you thought her converted into a stranger by her grand dress. And now, though I have dinner to get ready, I'll steal time to arrange you so that Edgar Linton shall look quite a doll beside you, and that he does. You are younger, and yet I'll be bound you are taller and twice as broad across the shoulders. You could knock him down in a twinkling. Don't you feel that you could? Heathcliff's face brightened in that moment. Then it was overcast afresh, and he sighed. But Nelly, if I knocked him down 20 times, that wouldn't make him any less handsome, or me more so. I wish I had light hair and a fair skin, and he was dressed and behaved as well, and had a chance of being as rich as he will be. And cried for mamma at every turn, I added, and trembled if a country lad heaved his fist against you, and sat at home all day for a shower of rain. Oh, Heathcliff, you are showing a poor spirit. Come to the glass, and I'll let you see what you should wish. Do you mark these 2 lines between your eyes, and those thick brows that instead of raising arched, sink in the middle? And that couple of black friends so deeply buried who never open their windows boldly, but lurk glinting under them, like devil's spies? Wish and learn to smooth away the surly wrinkles, and raise your lids frankly, and change the fiends to confident, innocent angels, suspecting and doubting nothing, and always seeing friends where there are not sure of foes. Don't get the expression of a vicious cur that appears to know what kicks it that appears to know the kicks it gets are its desert, and yet hates all the world as well as the kicker for what it suffers. In other words, I must wish for Edgar Linton's great blue eyes and even forehead, he replied. I do, and that won't help me to get them. A good heart will help you get a bonny face, my lad, I continued. If you're a regular black, and a bad one will turn the bonniest into something worse than ugly. And now that we've done washing and combing and sulking, tell me whether you don't think yourself rather handsome. I'll tell you. I do. You're fit for a prince in disguise. Who knows but your father was Emperor of China, and your mother an Indian queen, each of them able to buy you up with 1 week's income, Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange together, and you were kidnapped by wicked sailors and brought to England. Were I in your place, I'd frame high notions of my birth, and the thoughts of what I was should give me courage and dignity to support the oppressions of a little farmer. So I chatted on, and Heathcliff gradually lost his frown and began to look quite pleasant. When all at once our conversation was interrupted by a rumbling sound moving up the road and entering the court. He ran to the window, and I to the door, just in time to behold the 2 Lintons descend from the family carriage, smothered in cloaks and furs, and the Earnshaws dismounted from their horses. They often rode to church in winter. Catherine took a hand of each of the children and brought them into the house and set them there by the fire, which quickly put colour into their white faces. I urged my companion to hasten now and show his amiable humour, which he willingly obeyed. But ill luck would have it that, as he opened the door leading from the kitchen on one side, Hindley opened it on the other. They met, and the master, irritated at seeing him clean and cheerful, or perhaps eager to keep his promise to Mrs. Linton, shoved him back with a sudden thrust and angrily bade Joseph, "Keep the fellow out of the room, send him into the garret till dinner is over. He'll be cramming his fingers in the tarts and stealing the fruit if left alone with them a minute." "Nay, sir," I could not avoid answering, "he'll touch nothing, not he, and I suppose he must have his share of dainties as well as we." "He shall have the share of my hand, if I catch him downstairs till dark," cried Hindley. "Begone, you vagabond! What are you attempting the coxcomb, are you? Wait till I get hold of those elegant locks, see if I won't pull them a bit longer." "They're long enough already," observed Master Linton, peeping from the doorway. "I wonder they don't make his head ache. It's like a colt's mane over his eyes." Don't know what they're talking about. He ventured this remark without any intention to insult, but Heathcliff's violent nature was not prepared to endure the appearance of impertinence from one whom he seemed to hate, even then as a rival. He turned a tureen of hot apple sauce, the first thing that came under his gripe, and dashed it full against the speaker's face and neck, who instantly commenced a lament that brought Isabella and Catherine hurrying up to the place. Mr. Earnshaw snatched up the culprit directly and conveyed him to his chamber, where doubtless he administered a rough remedy to cool the fit of passion, for he reappeared red and breathless. I got the dishcloth and rather spitefully scrubbed Edgar's nose and mouth, affirming it served him right for meddling. His sister began weeping to go home, and Cathy stood by confounded, blushing for all. You should not have spoken to him, she expostulated with Master Linton. He was in a bad temper, and now you've spoiled your visit. And he'll be flogged again. I hate him to be flogged. I can't eat my dinner. Why did you speak to him, Edgar? I didn't, sobbed the youth, escaping from my hands and finishing the remainder of the purification with his cambric pocket handkerchief. I promised Mamma that I wouldn't say one word to him, and I didn't. Well, don't cry, replied Catherine contemptuously. You're not killed. Don't make more mischief. My brother is coming. Be quiet. Give over, Isabella. Has anybody hurt you? There, children, to your seats, cried Hindley, hustling in. That brute of a lad has warmed me nicely. Next time, Master Edgar, take the law into your own fists. It'll give you an appetite. The little party recovered its equanimity at the sight of the fragrant feast. They were hungry after their ride and easily consoled, since no real harm had befallen them. Mr. Earnshaw carved bountiful platefuls, and the mistress made them merry with lively talk. I waited behind her chair, and was pained to behold Catherine, with dry eyes and an indifferent air, commence cutting up the wing of a goose before her. An unfeeling child, I thought to myself. How likely she dismisses her old playmate's troubles. I could not have imagined her to be so selfish. She lifted a mouthful to her lips, then set it down again. Her cheeks flushed, and her tears gushed over them. She slipped her fork to the floor, and hastily dived under the cloth to conceal her emotion. I did not call her unfeeling for long, for I perceived she was in purgatory throughout the day, and wearying to find an opportunity of getting by herself, or paying a visit to Heathcliff, who had been locked up by the master, as I discovered on endeavouring to introduce to him a private mess of victuals. In the evening we had a dance. Cathy begged that he might be liberated then, as Isabella Linton had no partner. Her entreaties were in vain, and I was appointed to supply the deficiency. We got rid of all gloom in the excitement of the exercise, and one pleasure was increased by the arrival of the Gimmerton band, mustering 15 strong, a trumpet, a trombone, clarinets, bassoons, French horns, a bass viol, besides singers. They go to the rounds of the respectable houses and receive contributions every Christmas, and we esteemed it a first-rate treat to hear them. After the usual carols had been sung, we got them to songs and glees. Mrs. Earnshaw loved the music, and so they gave us plenty. Catherine loved it too, but she said it sounded sweetest at the top of the steps, and she went up in the dark. I followed. They shut the house door below, never noticing our absence. It was so full of people. She made no stay at the stairs head, but mounted further, to the garret where Heathcliff was confined, and called him. He stubbornly declined answering for a while. She persevered, and finally persuaded him to hold communion with her through the boards. I let the poor things converse unmolested, till I supposed the songs were going to cease, and the singers to get some refreshments, then clambered up the ladder to warn her. Instead of finding her outside, I heard the voice within. The little monkey had crept by the skylight of one garret, along the roof, into the skylight of the other, and it was with the utmost difficulty I could coax her out again. When she did come, Heathcliff came with her, and she insisted that I should take him into the kitchen, as my fellow servant had gone to a neighbour's to be removed from the sound of our devil's salmondry, as it pleased him to call it. I told them intended, but I intended by no means to encourage their tricks, but as the prisoner had never broken his fast since yesterday's dinner, I should wink at his cheating Mr. Hindley that once. He went down. I set him a stool by the fire and offered him a quantity of good things, but he was sick and could eat little, and my attempts to entertain him were thrown away. He leant his 2 elbows on his knees and his chin on his hands, and remained wrapped in dumb meditation. On my inquiring the subject of his thoughts, he answered gravely, "I'm trying to settle how I shall pay Hindley back. I don't care how long I wait, if I can only do it at last. I hope he will not die before I do." "Oh, for shame, Heathcliff," said I. "It is for God to punish wicked people. We should learn to forgive." "No, God won't have the satisfaction that I shall," he returned. "I only wish I knew the best way. Let me alone, and I'll plan it out. While I'm thinking of that, I don't feel pain." "But, Mr. Lockwood, I forget these tales cannot divert you. I'm annoyed now how I should dream of chattering on at such a rate, and your gruel cold, and you nodding for bed. I could have told Heathcliff's history, all that you need to hear, in half a dozen words." Thus interrupting herself, the housekeeper rose and proceeded to lay aside her sewing. But I felt incapable of moving from the hearth, and I was very far from nodding. "Sit still, Mrs. Dean," I cried. "Do sit still, another half hour. You've done just right to tell me the story leisurely. That is the method I like, and you must finish in the same style. I am interested in every character you have mentioned, more or less." "The clock is on the stroke of 11, sir." "No matter. I'm not accustomed to go to bed in the long hours. 1 or 2 is early enough for a person who lies till 10. "You shouldn't lie till 10. There's the very prime of the morning gone. Long before that time, a person who has not done one half his day's work by 10 o'clock runs a chance of leaving the other half undone." "Nevertheless, Mrs. Dean, resume your chair, because tomorrow I intend lengthening the night till afternoon. I prognosticate for myself an obstinate cold at least." "Oh, I hope not, sir." "Well, you must allow me to keep over some 3 years. During that space, Mrs. Earnshaw—" No, I'll allow nothing of the sort. You are acquainted with the mood of mind in which, if you were seated alone and the cat licking its kittens on the rug before you, you would watch the operation so intently that Puss's neglect of one ear would put you seriously out of temper. A terribly lazy mood, I should say. On the contrary, a tiresomely active one. It is mine at present, and therefore continue minutely. I perceive that people in these regions acquire over people in towns the value of a spider in a dungeon does over a spider in a cottage, to the various occupants, and yet the deepened attraction is not entirely opening to the situation of the onlooker. Is not entirely owing to the situation of the looker-on. They do live more in earnest, more in themselves, and less in surface change and frivolous external things. I could fancy a love for life here almost possible, and I was a fixed unbeliever in any love of a year's standing. One state resembles setting a hungry man down to a single dish on which he may concentrate his entire appetite, and do it justice. The other, introducing him to a laid table out by French cooks. He can perhaps extract as much enjoyment from the whole, but each part is mere atom in his regard and remembrance. Oh, here we are in the same anywhere else. When you get to know us... here we are the same as anywhere else when you get to know us, observed Mrs. Dean, somewhat puzzled at my speech. Excuse me, I responded. You, my good friend, are a striking evidence against that assertion. Excepting a few provincialisms of slight consequence, you have no marks of the manners which I am habituated to consider as particular to your class. I am sure that you have thought a great deal more than the generality of servants think. You have been compelled to cultivate your reflective faculties for want of occasions for frittering your life away in silly trifles. Mrs. Dean laughed. I certainly consider myself a steady, reasonable kind of body, she said. Not exactly from living amongst the hills and seeing one set of faces and one series of actions from year's end to year's end, but I have undergone sharp discipline which has taught me wisdom. And then I've read more than you would fancy, Mr. Lockwood. You could not open a book in this library that I have not looked into and got something out of, unless it be that range of Greek and Latin, and that of French, and those I know one from another. It is much as you can expect of a poor man's daughter. However, if I am to follow my story in true gossip's fashion, I had better go on, and instead of leaping 3 years, I will be content to pass the next summer, the summer of 1778, that is, nearly 23 years ago. End of chapter 7. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to follow me. Tap on my face, or I think it might be in the corner by now. And we'll read the next chapter, chapter 9, soon. And you can find all of the previous chapters in my YouTube timeline. So don't forget to subscribe and tap on the little bell to make sure you get notified every time I post something new. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.